Welcome back to our Dovetail cabin that I've been building. Been away for a while for some work that I had to attend to, but now I'm back and hoping to get organized again and working on the build this winter. We wanted to do a video on the most common question by far that we get: why leave the gaps between the logs on the cabin? So today we plan to do a video on trying to answer that question, why I'm leaving the gaps, and then maybe hopefully expanding the answer to why gaps would be left historically, some of the benefits and maybe drawbacks of leaving gaps, and then we'll cover some other stuff as well as what you could use to fill the gaps. I often get asked why I'm leaving gaps in the cabin, and for me the only reason is because I like the look of a finished cabin when you have the logs with the gap and then you've chinked the gap. And I'll talk about what that means, but for me it's pretty much exclusively the look of the cabin in the end. The research I've done on log cabins and trying to figure out how to build this one, I think that leaving the gaps is sort of maybe the more traditional or historical way of doing it, and I think there's multiple reasons for that. I think, and in no particular order, that one of the reasons would be that you can use less trees or less logs. So depending on the size of the gap you leave, you could probably use, one to several less logs per wall. So that way you could get your cabin built quicker. And if you were perhaps an early settler or someone who had some urgency to getting the cabin done, that would allow you to get it built quicker. So that's one reason. Some other reasons would be that I think it would allow you to use green lumber more easily, because if you were not leaving gaps, the logs would have to sit perfectly, let's say, on top of one another. Whereas when you're leaving the gaps, it allows some room for the logs to either twist or expand or shrink or change shape over time. And because of the gaps, that won't really affect the whole cabin structure as much. So the ability to use green wood would be another benefit. I think another benefit is you just have to be, generally speaking, less precise. If you're using, like for example, what I'm doing, if I wanted to have a fully scribed cabin, which is the alternative to the gaps, my logs would have to be essentially the same dimension pretty much consistently to have them sit flush on top of one another. With this, there can be some fluctuation in the size of the logs, and for me, as I was learning to use a sawmill as part of this process, like not all of my logs are exactly the same size. They're close, but not exactly the same. So then that's another benefit, is just you don't have to be quite as precise in what you're doing. And I think another benefit would be, and this is less of an issue, or perhaps not even an issue when you're using logs like I have that I've milled, but if you're using round logs that had, let's say on the butt end a big diameter and on the tail end a small diameter, in order to fully scribe that with fully scribed notches, you would end up, I think, using or wasting a lot of lumber, and I don't think it would be practical to do a fully scribed cabin, depending on the type of logs you're using. And another benefit, I think, would just be that over time, as the cabin changes, and that can be, I think, season to season, but particularly just as it dries, that the logs can twist and change shape without as much of an impact on the total cabin structure. People often will ask what chinking is, let's say. And I think there's sort of two terms that get used. One is chinking, which is an older term that still gets used, and the other one is daubing. And so I'll explain what I think the definitions of both terms are, and I could be wrong. This is just what I've gathered from the internet and other YouTube videos. Chinking, I believe, is really the say firm filler material that goes between the logs, and that can be multiple different things. I think historically, sometimes maybe it was wood or rocks or ash, silt, just kind of anything firm that could start to fill these gaps. And I think that's what chinking is called. And then daubing, as I understand it, is sort of the mortar-like material, which again can be made from multiple things, that then finishes filling the gap and seals up in terms of like preventing airflow in or out. So yeah, I think chinking is what fills the majority of the gap and might be more of a solid material, and daubing is more of a mortar-like material that then sort of finishes the look. I think those are the terms historically, but now most videos and things I see refer to the whole thing as chinking, and I think practically speaking, when someone talks about chinking now, they're mostly just saying the stuff that ends up filling in this gap. So for my purposes, I'll probably just call what I'm doing chinking. I may not use the term daubing at all, really. And like I said earlier in the video, I think the style of chinking in general is more of a traditional way of building a log cabin. And I think it might be that we've become so accustomed to thinking of a log cabin as this perfectly scribed thing where the logs sit right on top of one another. And that's probably because a lot of things we see now are from kits, log cabin kits or professional builds, which there's completely nothing wrong with. They look great. But I think going back, like I've seen this, cabins that are several hundred years old in Europe, as well as the southern US, in the Appalachian area, and I believe in Ontario there's examples of this as well, where hundreds of years ago this is what they were doing. So the other thing you'll notice if you start looking at different styles of chinked cabins is the gap size can really vary. So like mine is roughly 2 inches in a lot of places, sometimes more, sometimes maybe a little less. But there's other cabins that I've seen that it's many inches, like maybe it's 4 or 6 inches that is chinked, and all of that can work. And for me, when I started doing this dovetail cabin, as most of you know if you've been watching the channel, I used a jig system on a website called logdovetailJig.com, and his plans that you can get for the jigs allow you to make any size gap you want, really. So I just picked 2 inches because I kind of like it to look more log than chinking, but I wanted to leave enough of a gap, again, that I could have all those benefits that I talked about earlier, where if the logs change or shrink or expand or twist, that I still get the structure of the cabin intact. Some other purposes of chinking would be to keep whatever weather's outside from getting inside, to keep heat and act as an insulation, to keep your heat inside, and then also to keep rodents and insects from getting inside your cabin. Things I've seen or heard about that can be used for chinking the gaps in a log cabin can be, some people use wood, some people use rock, clay. Seen a picture one time of people use like dried corn cobs to stuff in. I've heard about animal hair. I've seen, there's a cabin not too far from here that I've seen plastic bags and newspapers used. So really, I think depending on your preferences or budget or style, kind of anything could be used. Those would be more, most of those would be more historical things or natural things. I think moss, various types can be used. And then more modern things I'm seeing used, and there's probably pros and cons to all of these different types, but spray foam insulation. I've seen a lot of these modern chinking products that are like specifically made for chinking, that are sort of a pliable mortar-like material. So there's a whole bunch of things, traditional, natural, and modern, that could be used. I'm not sure what I'm going to use yet. I'm open to ideas. So there's kind of, as I understand it, 2 options roughly for how you build a cabin. There's either this gaps that you then chink, or there's what's called a full scribed cabin, or fully scribed cabin. And my understanding of that is just that whether you use round logs or you're using flat logs or D-shaped logs, or whatever kind you're using, that they end up sitting right on top of each other. And that looks great. I really like that style of cabin too. It wasn't the one I wanted to build in the end, but that's a great style. I think you have to, you just have to be more precise when you're doing that, I think. And probably dry logs would be more important. I mean, I'm still using relatively dry logs, but yeah, dry logs would probably be more important in that situation. These are kind of the things I wanted to talk about in this video. Hopefully it answers a lot of the questions that I'm getting about why I'm leaving the gaps, or comments about how people think the gaps are good, or how they think maybe that I should have put the logs right together. I had a comment once about someone who said that they would have built the cabin so tight that they couldn't fit a piece of newspaper through it. But these are the reasons I'm doing it, and hopefully answered that question, as well as maybe giving a little more detail about why in general this might be done historically or now. And as I get moving forward on the cabin, I'll try to do a video hopefully later this summer or fall when I actually start the chinking process about how I do it. But I'm going to have to do some research and talk to folks about maybe the best way for me to go ahead on that.